have the upper hand right now, so it seems like. All right, we're going to wrap up the Day of Atonement, and then next week, Anthony will take over, and we'll start a new series. But wanted to share this. I've got a handout Sheila's going to grab for me, and I love what Edersheim does. He actually kind of walks through this day in great detail. And so if we have time, I may read part of that to you. I find it really fascinating. You might find it really boring. I don't know. But it's really interesting going into the nuances of how this day was spent. So from last week, anybody kind of want to catch us up with what we talked about? Why is this day so important? What is it that's unique about the Day of Atonement? What does atonement mean? What's that? At one mint? It means to cover up. Okay. Now I'm a little bit too loud, it seems like, maybe, Connie. Getting a little feedback. So let's talk. So we talked a little bit about what's going on, the connection with what we see in Hebrews. Jesus as the perfect high priest doesn't have the limitations that the earthly high priest had, right? The earthly high priest had to make himself be in a position of being clean so he could even perform the rites of the Day of Atonement, right? So Aaron, when he first did this, he had to go and present sacrifices for himself and his family. He had to be to wash himself, to be ceremonially clean. He would then go take 2 handfuls of incense and go behind the curtain into the Holy of Holies. It was dark in there. There was no natural light because it was an interior room, right? The only light would be from this censer full of coals that he was carrying, right? So there'd be probably a red glow, right? And then he would throw the incense on this censer and create this cloud of smoke to further isolate his human frailty from God's holiness, right? Because even after he was clean, after he had sacrificed a sin offering for he and his family, he was still in the presence of God, and God could kind of barely tolerate him being there, right? So they did this incense to enable him to stand before God and not be killed, because we're simply not worthy of being able to do that. And we talked about how in Hebrews, the writer talks about the need for a perfect sacrifice, that the sacrifice of bulls and goats wasn't adequate to allow man to reconnect, reconcile with our relationship with God. And Jesus, as the ultimate sacrifice, not only was able to be that sacrifice for us, but also stood as the high priest in the true temple, the heavenly temple, of which the tabernacle and temple on earth were simply a shadow, a representation of. So let's talk a little bit about that day. And like I said, I've got a handout for you. It's kind of lengthy, but I thought we might walk through this day a little bit. So in preparation for the day, everybody who could would fit in the temple grounds before the tabernacle and watch this event taking place. And they would put thin kind of a gauzy curtain between the people and the priest when he was taking his bath and things like that. But everybody was there and watching this event. It was considered to be a high Sabbath, right? So even though this was always on the seventh month and the 10th day of the month. So these are important numbers in Jewish symbolism. 7 means perfection, right? And 10 is complete. So, seventh month, on the 10th day, this event took place. It was a special, special day. And whatever day of the week it occurred on, it was considered to be a high Sabbath. So, all the rules and expectations for not working and things like that that you would do on any normal Saturday Sabbath in the Jewish culture also happened this day. And the people would set themselves apart, and they had to, the scripture in Leviticus that we read last week was they must deny themselves, afflict themselves in mourning over their sins of the year. And generally that meant was they fasted from the evening before and until the evening of the high Sabbath or the Day of Atonement. The priest, the high priest alone did all the functions that day. He was a busy guy because they had the regular daily sacrifices they did. So instead of the priestly group or who were selected doing the morning sacrifice, the high priest had to do that. And there were regulations around that. So he wore his priestly garments to do that. So he had a special robe that was golden and kind of pretty, and turban that he wore, and a colorful sash, and the unum and thummim that was on his chest, those stones. So he got up, cleansed himself for that, would go and perform the morning sacrifice. And when all that was done, and he was ready to do the Day of Atonement, he had to take all that off because he was changing clothes. He had to cleanse himself again, so another bath, and then he would prepare to do the Day of Atonement. Thank you, Sheila. I'm going to hand those out in a minute, okay? Thanks, guys, but I don't want you guys to read ahead. All right, so he would get ready, take this bath in water. He would take off his normal robes for the glory, beauty, and holiness and put on the garments for this special day. And they were all in white, which would represent purity, cleanliness. Right, exactly right. He had a linen tunic. He would have a white sash as a belt around that. He had a white turban on as a hat. And it was all white. And then he would prepare the sacrificial animals. Tradition says that they were pinned up for a week just so they could be examined for defects. And 5 animals were required for the Day of Atonement ceremonies, not including the other daily sacrifices. And occasionally that 10th day of the 7th month would actually fall on a Sabbath day, and they would have all the regular Sabbath sacrifices to do too. So it was a crazy busy day whenever that overlapped. So it was a bull for the sin offering for the priestly family, a male sheep for the burnt offering for the priestly family, the 2 goats as one sacrifice, as a sin offering for the congregation, one for the Lord and one for Azazel. And that is the atonement or the guilt part, because they separated those 2 things. We talked about that last week in detail. And then finally, a male sheep for a burnt offering for the congregation. So these animals had to be physically perfect, no defects at all. Traditionally, the 2 goats were selected to be as much alike as possible so that there was no difference at all. And they represented Christ's spiritual perfection, whom they foreshadow when he was crucified and presented himself as a sacrifice in the heavenly temple. First, they were presented to the Lord at the entrance, and they were presented to God alone. So in what I'm going to hand out, what that looked like was the animals had their backsides to the people and the temple. And this was a representation that they belonged to God. And the purpose was for a national atonement. And then he would cast lots. So originally in the tabernacle in the first temple, there were two stones with writing on them. One said Jehovah, said Azazel. All right, and so they were in a urn, vase-looking thing. He would stick both hands in, grab a stone in each, and then you'd stand there between the two goats and stick these stones on the back of the goat, and that would label them. One for the goat to be sent to the wilderness, one for the one to be sacrificed, right? Tradition had it that if the one to be sacrificed was on his right, that stone that he grabbed, then that was like a good thing. I don't know why that was perceived as a good thing, but there is a dominant right-handed, kind of a theme you see in the Old Testament. So perhaps it's that simple. And then the one that was designed to be sacrificed, designated to be sacrificed, a ribbon was tied around its neck. And the one for Azazel, it was tied around its horn, so they could tell which one it is. And then Aaron would kill the bull of the priest's sin offering. He did not lay his hands on it. The hands, that was laid on the goat, that of the guilt that was sent out into the wilderness. And then the blood of the bull will make atonement for himself in the house. Then he goes into the Holy of Holies and takes the 2 handfuls of incense. He gets coals. Where's the right place to get the coals? He gets them from the altar, because that's the fire, the only fire that God allows. We talked about that 2 weeks ago with Nadab and Abihu. And then the incense is perfumed over the atonement seat to conceal it, to further create some isolation between God's presence over the mercy seat and Aaron's presence of man standing before him. And this also represented a prayer by Aaron that he not die, because he's still considered sinful in the presence of a sinless God. And then he sprinkles the blood of the bull on the mercy seat, and then before the mercy seat 7 times. And we'll see in this handout that he had a rote phrase that he would say to help him remember to do this right. And also it talks about in here, is one of the things I find so fascinating, is they made him practice all week. Like he was, isolated, and they had to practice with elders of the Sanhedrin to make sure he had all this stuff down. So he would literally say, 1 up for the slinging the blood. He'd put it on dip his finger in the blood, sling it on top of the mercy seat, and then he'd say, 1 down, 2 down, 3 down. Just very detailed, right? But there's a lot of import put on getting it right. So he would do this and do before the mercy seat 7 times. And then before the veil, he would go out and do it at the altar, I believe. And then the rest he leaves in a vessel, because it's combined with the blood from the goat that's sacrificed later on. Then he kills the goat for Jehovah, but before Jehovah, and it's done for man's sinfulness and contamination and guilt upon God's house and tabernacle. So he's still just making the place ready, right? All of this is to make it appropriate for this interface, interaction before God. Then he lays both hands, one for the priest, the other for the people, on the head of the goat that is to be sent in the wilderness. And he confesses over the goat all of Israel's sins. And in this write-up, it actually records one of the things that he would say. I don't know what time frame it's from, but it's kind of interesting to see that. confesses all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and puts it on the goat's head. And then the goat's removed and sent to the desert. And it carries their sins away and it's released into the wilderness. The person who releases it has touched the goat, which is covered with man's sins, right? So that person is now unclean and has to be cleansed before they can be back right and before God. As we see in this description, later generations took a goat to a cliff and would push it over the cliff. And then, now that the Day of Atonement ceremonies are done, Aaron changes his robes again and clothes himself in his royal high priest robes. And he sacrifices the burnt offering for the priest and the congregation, one ram for the priest, one ram for the people, and then the blood is sprinkled. The fat of the bull and the goat are burned, and then the bodies were disposed of outside of the camp, which makes this distinct from the other burnt offerings, and consumed with the fires of the seraph. And this, what is parallel about this part with Jesus's death, right? Jesus's body was taken out of Jerusalem, right? And he was killed too on the Mount of Olives, or on Golgotha, sorry. And but his body was taken away. So there's all these parallels between what happened with Jesus and this process. So Azazel means to remove. It's a compound word. The sins were symbolically removed from the camp, taken to the wilderness, and the goat is released. But the goat isn't sacrificed, and the sins, this guilt part of things is still there. It was really important, and Edersheim, in his description here, really emphasizes that these two goats were considered a single sacrifice. They were two parts of one sacrifice. The goat that was sacrificed to Jehovah was the cause of forgiveness, and the goat of Azazel was the effect of the forgiveness, that those sins were removed, right? That was the effect. And the notes here from the Rogers, I think, did this. Gerald Payton wrote this up. Talks about that there's some symbolism here too about Jesus's, the goat went to the desert, foreshadows Jesus' resurrection as he survived the sacrifice, right? So he was the only one who was actually able to live again. Aaron prepared by this change of clothes. Jesus unclothed himself in a spiritual sense of the heavenly glory to become a humble servant and a priest as a simple man. And as such, he accomplished atonement for all men because he went and stood sinless in the heavenly Holy of Holies. And then he reclothed himself with his royal robes of heavenly splendor at his ascension. So what about the sins that are in the desert? You know, they're on the head of the goat in the desert. Do they stay there? No, they're addressed with the sacrifice of Jesus too, right? So Israel, and we talked about this last week, was confident. We read scriptures from Psalms and several things about the statement that we are forgiven. There was a confidence they're forgiven, but it was based off of a promise that something in our physical timeline hadn't happened yet with Jesus' death. But his death did forgive their sins for all time, just like ours future sins are also forgiven by that single event. So think about it. One goat every year throughout Israel's history. That's 1,500 goats roughly that were at the foot of the cross with that sin to be placed on Jesus. Just like our sin was placed on Jesus, and our yet to be sins were placed on Jesus. And God removed that sin with the sacrifice of Jesus when he carried that on them. 3 days later, he rose and conquered the price, which was death, instead of us having to do it spiritually. Then he returned to heaven. We have that promise of returning to heaven too. So just to summarize, and then I'm going to hand this out and we'll look at it. Each individual's life is lost for God. And we talked last week about the sin problem that started in the garden, and that there was this separation between God and man. And the temple and the law were just there to teach us about these heavenly things, so that when Jesus came for our redemption, for our atonement, these things would be complete. And so I think it's valuable for us to understand what was happening here, because it is an insight into a heavenly thing. So Jesus' purity was seen. Only a sinless sacrifice would satisfy the debt to be paid, and it create this reconciliation. Somehow God was able to put man's sin on Jesus, and he was able to put Jesus's innocence on man. So Jesus was able to be present as the first fruits, as the truly perfect sacrifice before man, in lieu of man, and man can now be restored to the fellowship of God. And so it's fascinating to me. And when we did this class off in the fellowship room, we went a little bit more detail about how Jesus met every requirement of every sacrifice. It's really fascinating study. So I encourage you to do that a little bit more sometime. Okay, let's look at this. When you read through the Bible and you get to Leviticus, I think it's an area that we often kind of skim through pretty quick. The sacrificial system doesn't mean a lot to us outside of the Hebrew world. But when you really dig into it and try to understand it, it's pretty amazing situation. So I hope we have enough of these to share around. So okay, you can read through this with me. I'm just going to pick some highlights out. We got about 15 minutes, and it might take all of that to kind of read through this. It's 10 pages of fairly detail about this day. But I would encourage you, if you want to, just sit there and close your eyes. Try to visualize what's going on, right? Think about what's happening. Edersheim does a great job of kind of highlighting what's going on. If you're sleepy, maybe you shouldn't do that. All right, so I added this little section about the red heifer. I don't think Mike covered the red heifer. It's a really unique sacrifice that was done. They had to find this this calf that was perfectly red in color. It couldn't have a single hair of white. So it was a very rare genetic thing, right? And if I remember right, this red heifer thing only happened every 50 years, and this sacrifice was burned, and the ashes were saved, and it was used for a special event when somebody touched something dead and they needed to be cleansed from that. Then these ashes would be sprinkled on them from the red heifer. So there's some references to that. I added that at the beginning here, just as a touch point. So before the Day of the Atonement, the high priest left his own house in Jerusalem and took up his abode in his chambers in the temple. And a substitute was appointed for him in case he should die or become Levitically unfit for his duties. In fact, Edersheim doesn't say this, but my understanding is that when he goes into the Holy Place, they actually tie a rope to his foot so that if he struck dead, they could pull him out because nobody else was allowed to go in there, right? But his son, the next high priest, his firstborn son, would always be kind of on standby, just in case. Rabbinical punctiliousness went so far as to have him twice sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer on the third and seventh day of his week of separation, just in case he had unwittingly to himself been defiled by a dead body. During the whole of that week, also, he had to practice the various priestly rites, such as the sprinkling of the blood. Remember? One. Burning the incense, lighting the lamp, offering the daily sacrifice. For as already stated, every part of that day's services devolved on the high priest. All right, just a comment. This was written in 1890, okay? So his English is not our English. Just be aware, all right? Some of the elders of the Sanhedrin were appointed to see to it that the high priest fully understood and knew the meaning of the service. Otherwise, they were to instruct him in it. And on the eve of the Day of Atonement, the various sacrifices were brought before him that there might be nothing strange about the services of the morrow. And finally, they bound him by a solemn oath not to change anything in the rites of the day. And this was chiefly for fear of the Sadducean notion that the incense should be lighted before the high priest actually entered into the holy place, most holy place, while the Pharisees held that this was to be done only within the most holy place itself. And then he gives why. The evening meal of the high priest before the great day was to be scanty. All night long he was to be hearing and expounding the Holy Scriptures, or otherwise kept employed so that he might not fall asleep, again for special Levitical reasons. And at midnight the lot was cast for removing the ashes and preparing the altar and to distinguish the Day of Atonement from all others. 4 instead of the usual 3 fires were arranged on the great altar of the burnt offering. And the services of the day began with the first streak of morning light. Already the people had been admitted into the sanctuary. Remember how many people we talked about? Over 100,000 people would be there physically watching this. So jealous were they of any innovation or alteration that only a linen cloth excluded the high priest from the public view, when each time before changing his garments, he bathed, not in the ordinary place of the priest, but in that one a special place set apart for his use. Altogether, he changed his raiments and washed his whole body 5 times, and washed his hands and feet 10 times. He adds a note here: if he was old and infirm and the water needed to be heated, then they would heat it for him, either by adding warm water or putting hot metal in the water. He did not wash on that day in the ordinary laver, but in a golden vessel specially provided for the purpose. When the first dawn of morning was announced in the usual manner, the high priest put off his ordinary layman's dress, bathed, and put on his golden vestments, washed his hands and feet, and proceeded to perform all the principal parts of the ordinary morning sacrifice. Tradition has it that immediately after that, he offered certain parts of the burnt sacrifices for the day. The bull and the 7 lambs, reserved his own lamb and that of the people, as well as the sin offering of the kid of the goats, till after the special expiatory sacrifices of the day had been brought. Leviticus 16:24 is against this view and shows the whole burnt offerings and the festive sin offerings were brought after the expiatory services. Jumping down to the sin offering. The morning service finished. This was the regular thing they did every day. Now the high priest washed his hands and his feet, put off his gold investments, bathed, put on his linen garments, again, washed his hands and his feet, and proceeded to the peculiar part of the day services. The bull for his sin offering stood between the temple porch and the altar. It was placed towards the south. But the high priest, who stood facing east, that is, the worshipers, turned the head of the sacrifice towards the west to face the sanctuary, these being dedicated to God. And this is how they showed that. And then he laid both his hands on the head of the bullock. He asked as follows: Ah, Jehovah, I've committed iniquity. I have transgressed. I have sinned, I and my house. Oh, then, Jehovah, I entreat thee, cover over, atone for the iniquities, the transgressions, and the sins which I have committed, transgressed, and sinned before thee, I and my house, even as it is written in the law of Moses, thy servant. For on that day will he cover over for you to make you clean. From all your transgressions before Jehovah ye shall be cleansed. If you notice, in this solemn confession, the name Jehovah occurred 3 times. Other 3 times it was pronounced in the confession with the high priest made over the same bullock for the priesthood, and a 7th time it was uttered when he cast the lot as to which of the 2 goats was to be for Jehovah. And once again, he spoke it 3 times in the confession over the so-called scapegoat, which bore the sins of the people. All these 10 times the high priest pronounced the very name of Jehovah. And as he spoke it, those who stood near would cast their faces on the ground, because this is the only time they actually spoke the name of God. They would just say Lord otherwise, right? Blessed be the name, the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. Formerly, it had been the practice to pronounce the so-called ineffable name distinctly, but afterwards, when some attempted to make use of it for magical purposes, it was spoken with bated breath. And he quotes from a Rabbi Tryphon for his source here, who had stood amongst the priests in the temple and listened with rapt attention to cast the mysterious name, and was lost amidst all the background noise, instruments, and the priests and the benediction of the people. Choosing the scapegoat. The first part of the expiatory service that for the priesthood had taken place close to the holy place between the porch and the altar. The next was performed close to the worshiping people. In the eastern part of the court of priests, that is, close to the worshipers, and on the north side of it stood an urn called Calphi, in which there were 2 lots of the same shape, size, and material. In the second temple, they were of gold, the one bearing inscription, La Jehovah for Jehovah, and the other La Azazel for Azazel. And leaving the expression for the present untranslated. These 2 goats had been placed with their backs to the people and their faces towards the sanctuary, which was west. And the high priest now faced the people, standing between his substitute at his right hand and the head of the course on the ministry on his left hand. He shook the urn, stuck his hands in it, and at the same time drew the 2 lots, laying one each on the head of a goat. It was deemed good augury if the right-hand lot had fallen for Jehovah. The 2 goats, however, must be altogether alike in look, size, and value. And indeed, so earnestly was sought to carry out the idea that these 2 form parts of one and the same sacrifice, that it was arranged, if possible, they were purchased at the same time. Then the lot having designated each of the 2 goats, the high priest tied a tongue-shaped piece of scarlet cloth to the horn of the goat for Azazel, the so-called scapegoat, and the other around the throat of the goat for Jehovah, which was to be slain. The goat that was to be sent forth was now turned around towards the people and stood facing them, waiting, as it were, till their sins should be laid on him, and he would carry them forth into a land not inhabited. Assuredly, a more marked type or shadow of Christ could not be conceived, as he was brought by Pilate and stood before the people, just as he was about to be led forth, bearing the iniquity of the people. And as if to add the significance of the rite, tradition has it when the sacrifice was fully accepted, the scarlet mark which the scapegoat had borne became white. to symbolize the gracious promise, Isaiah 118, which says, though their sins were as scarlet, they will be white as snow. But it adds to this miracle did not take place for 40 years before the destruction of the temple. In other words, it stopped upon the death of Jesus. With this presentation of the scapegoat before the people commenced the third and most solemn part of the expiatory services of the day. The high priest now once more returned towards the sanctuary, and a second time laid his two hands on the bullock, which still stood between the porch and the altar, to confess over him not only as before his own and his household sins, but also those of the priest. The formula used precisely this was the same as before, with the addition of the words, "The seed of Aaron, thy holy people," both in the confession and the petition for atonement. Then the high priest killed the bullock, caught up its blood in a vessel, and gave it to an attendant to keep it stirring. They literally sit there with a bowl and keep it stirring so it wouldn't coagulate. Advancing to the altar of the burnt offering, he next filled the censer with burning coals and arranged a handful of frankincense in the dish destined to hold it. Ordinary, everything brought into the actual ministry unto God must be carried in the right hand, hence the incense on the right and the censer on the left. But on this occasion, as the censer for the Day of Atonement was larger and heavier than usual, the high priest was allowed to reverse the order, and every eye would be strained towards the sanctuary as, slowly bearing the censer and incense, the figure of the white-robed high priest was seen to disappear within the holy place. After that, nothing further could be seen of his movements. The curtain of the most holy place was folded back, and the high priest stood alone and separated from all the people in the awful gloom of the holiest of all, only lit up by the red glow of the coals in the priest's censer. In the first temple, the ark of God had stood there with the mercy seat overshadowing it above it, the visible presence of Jehovah in the cloud of the Shekinah. And on either side of the outspread wings of the cherubim, and the high priest had placed the censer between the staves of the ark. But in the temple of Herod, there was neither Shekinah nor ark. All was empty, and the high priest rested his censer on a large stone called the foundation stone. He now most carefully emptied the incense into his hand, threw it onto the coals of the censer as far from himself as possible, and waited till the smoke had filled the most holy place. Then, retreating backwards, he prayed outside the veil as follows: May it please thee, O Lord our God, and the God of our fathers, that neither this day nor during this year any captivity come upon us. Yet, if captivity befall us on this day or year, let it be a place where the law is cultivated. May it please thee, O Lord our God, and the God of our fathers, that want not come upon us, either this day or this year. But if want visit us this day or this year, let it be due to the liberality of our charitable deeds. May it please thee, O Lord our God, and the God of our fathers, that this year may be a year of cheapness, of fullness, of intercourse and trade, a year with abundance of rain, of sunshine and dew, one in which thy people, Israel, shall not require assistance one from another. And listen not to the prayers of those who are about to set out on a journey. And as thy people, Israel, may no enemy exalt himself against them, may it please thee, O Lord our God, and the God of our fathers, that the houses of the men of Sauron may not become their graves. The high priest was not to prolong this prayer, lest his protracted absence might fill the people with fears for his safety. Then the sprinkling of the blood, and I'll finish after this paragraph since we're out of time. While the incense was offered in the most holy place, the people withdrew from proximity to it and worshipped in silence. And at last the people saw the high priest emerging from the sanctuary, and they knew that the service had been accepted. Rapidly he took from the attendant who had kept it stirring the blood of the bullock. Once more he entered into the most holy place and sprinkled with his finger once upwards towards where the mercy seat had been, and 7 times downwards, counting as he did so, once and twice, and so on until he got to once and 7 times, always repeating the word once, which referred to the upward sprinkling so as to prevent any mistake. Coming out from the most holy place, the high priest now deposited the bowl with the blood before the veil, and he killed the goat set apart for Jehovah, and entering the most holy place a 3rd time, sprinkled as before, once upwards, 7 times downwards, and again deposited the bowl with the blood of the goat on a 2nd golden stand before the veil. Taking up the bowl with the bullock's blood, he next sprinkled once upward and 7 times downwards towards the veil outside the most holy place, and then did the same with the blood of the goat. Finally, pouring the blood of the bullock into the bowl which contained that of the goat, and again the mixture of the two into that which had held the blood of the bull, so as to thoroughly commingle the two, he sprinkled each of the horns of the altar of incense, and then making a clear space on the altar 7 times the top of the altar of incense. Thus he had sprinkled 43 times with the expiatory blood, taking care of his own dress, that it should never be spotted with the sin-laden blood. What was left of the blood, the high priest poured out on the west side of the base of the altar. I want to share real quickly many stadia to what they deemed the wilderness. And so because it was a Sabbath day and they had their Pharisaical rules about how far you could walk, it was exactly 10 persons' Sabbath walks to where they what they deemed the wilderness. So they had a relay, and 10 men would stand there and take the goat and lead it further out to the wilderness. And then they had walked as far as they could that day, right? So they just had to wait there. And for some reason, tradition had it that this was done by foreigners. And so it was led out of town, which is interesting given the Romans killed Jesus, right? There's a parallel there. So these 10 men would walk the goat out, and each time they would tear a little bit of the cloth off to kind of track its progress. And then the last guy would take it to the cliff and push it over the cliff. And then he was unclean, so he would have to be cleansed before he could be around people again. And then they had flags to signal back to the temple that it was done. And that was the end of that process. So thanks for sharing with me. I hope that wasn't too lengthy. I really encourage you to read it. I find it really fascinating, especially when you consider there's some extra stuff that they added in there out of kind of being overzealous that was not commanded, right? And so you just see the man continues to meddle with God's way, even in this most special day. Thank you.